Even though N comes first in the alphabet, let's start with N. 3 of the 4 letters that we're going to be going over today starts with the stem on the diagonal slant. Line your brush up with the diagonal slant and start with your brush tip on the middle guideline. Bring the brush tip down with heavy pressure. From the bottom guideline where you left off with the stem, continue writing the N by bringing the brush tip up with light pressure toward the middle guideline of the next slant. As you get to the next slant, descend the brush down with heavy pressure. That's how you make the hump of your N. N is one of those very straightforward letters where, as long as you're making sure to follow the guidelines as proportions, follow the slants for consistency, and be mindful of the pressure that you're applying to the brush, you should be A-okay. Like I had mentioned, make sure that you're using the guidelines as well as the slants. Keep in mind that the strokes are contained within the middle and bottom guidelines, and the brush strokes you want to follow for this letter are down, up, and then back down. Following the guidelines will make this part of the calligraphy drills a lot easier. If you feel comfortable, you can try combining N with vowels that we've already covered. The letter N will need a tail when it's preceding a letter. You can make that by bringing the brush tip back up after making the second descent on the letter N. Once you do this, you just need to make sure that your second letter touches the tail of the N. If the N comes after a vowel, you would just write it the way that you've been practicing. Let's rewind back and work on M. Line your brush stroke up with the diagonal slant and start with your brush tip on the middle guideline and bring the brush tip down with heavy pressure. From the bottom guideline where you left off with the stem, bring the brush tip up with light pressure toward the middle guideline of the next slant. As you get to the next slant, descend the brush down with heavy pressure. Experiencing déjà vu? That's because writing M is exactly like writing N. The only difference is that you would just need to add a second hump. You do this by repeating the motion where you lift the brush up with light pressure, bring it back down on the next slant with heavy pressure. Similar to writing N, writing M is going to rely on using your guidelines. The only space that you're going to be using is between the middle and bottom guidelines, and all vertical brush movements downward will be on the slants. The brush stroke should be as follows: down on the slant, up towards the next slant, down again on the next slant, up towards again to the next slant, and down again on that next slant. If you're comfortable, try connecting M with vowels that we've practiced already. Like N, if M is preceding a letter, you'll need a tail. If not, you can just write it the same way that you've been practicing. O is a unique letter that we haven't practiced yet. The space that you're using is between the middle and bottom guidelines. I start with my brush tip at the top of where I plan to make my O's, which is typically between the two slants, and it's a little closer to the left. I bring the brush tip down with heavy pressure, making sure to round that part of my O as I bring it down. When the brush hits the bottom guideline, I bring it back up with light pressure, making sure to round my stroke on the way up as well. When I get back to the top, I make a loop by bringing my brush over to the right and flicking it up for the tail. The overall shape of the O looks kind of like an almond. At least mine does. Although, of course, as you explore different styles of writing, you may find that your O's have different shapes. Start between the slants on the middle guideline and make the almond shape. It's easy to get carried away and maybe make the O's a little too short, but make sure that the bottom of the O touches the bottom guideline. I would encourage you to try going nice and slow to make sure that you're filling all of that space. I didn't mention this earlier, but you don't need to make a loop at the top either. You can close out your circle and leave it at that. I like at least practicing making that loop because it allows for a nice and easy connection or transition to the next letter. To connect your O's, you don't need to do anything at all. Since we practiced writing that tail already, there's nothing that you need to change or do in addition when you're adding a letter after or before the O. The last letter that we're going to go over today is P. Remember that I had mentioned that 3 of 4 of these letters are going to start with the stem. Well, this is the last letter. The stem is going to start in a similar place as M and N, but it's not going to stop at the bottom guideline. It's going to extend past the bottom guideline. Once you've made the stem, bring the brush tip back up and start the oval of the P on the stem, in between the bottom and middle guidelines. Bring the brush up and around to make an egg shape. It's not necessary to loop the tail of the P through the egg, but I do that on most occasions. You can also close out the oval where you started the stem. Making the stem along the diagonal slant will make it much easier to start the letter. Remember to extend the stem beyond the bottom guideline enough. If you make it too short, it could be difficult to read within the context of a word. When you're making the oval of the P, I like to use the diagonal slant to tell me how big the oval should be. It should be contained within the space between the two slants and the middle and bottom guidelines. To connect P's to other letters, make sure not to flick the tail down too much because you need to make a smooth and natural looking transition to a different letter. This is similar to what we had to do for the tails of G's. That concludes our M through P video. You can find all products that I use listed in the video description below. Subscribe to stay tuned for more lettering videos, and don't forget to sign up for my mailing list to download these calligraphy guide sheets if you haven't done so already. You can visit my website at www.inkarella.com. To support me, you can visit my Patreon page where you can get access to early YouTube content and lettering videos. Speaking of which, special thanks to David Chen for your support last month on my Patreon videos. Thanks for watching!